How can we make this component reusable? Well, the good news is we can already reuse it. In app.js, where I'm using it, we can simply copy that line and paste it in, and if we save everything, we got 2 expense items already. So that was easy. It's super easy to reuse a component. You can use it as often as you want. You can add it 2 more times and have 4 expense items overall. That will work. But of course, at the moment, it's not really reusable. Yes, it's technically more than once, but it's always displaying the same data. And the reason for that is that the data is baked into this component. Now, think about regular JavaScript without React for a second. There, I mentioned earlier already, we also use functions to split functionality across multiple smaller code bases, and also to have reusable functions which we can call multiple times. Now, when we write functions in JavaScript, then we make these functions reusable by accepting parameters. And that allows us to call one and the same function with different parameter values. And therefore, the function may and typically will produce different results for different input values, but it's still always the same function being called. And React basically has the same concept built in. We can make our components reusable by using parameters and a concept called props in React. Let's say in your app component, you have a goal item variable or constant defined, which holds a string of finish. And then let's say you have a custom component, the course goal item component, which has a list item inside of it, where this goal item should be output. That's just another example, not the code we've been working on, but it's another example. We can have a custom component which should output a list item, where the goal item should be output dynamically. The problem is that the goal item variable lives in the app component, not in the course goal item component. And to a certain extent that is good, because it makes the course goal item independent if it doesn't store the concrete value internally. But of course, we want to define what's being output by a course goal item with help of the variable managed in app. And we don't have direct access to the HTML code output by some component in other components. We can't just send our stored data there. But instead, we can utilize a concept called props. We can pass data to the custom component by adding an attribute. And inside of that component, we can then get access to all these attributes which might have been set on our custom component. Again, we're basically building our own custom HTML elements. And just as HTML elements can have attributes, it turns out that with React, our own custom components can also have attributes. There, this concept is just called props instead of attributes. And props simply stands for properties. We can set properties of our own custom components. Now, how does this props concept work though? In expense item, we have the date, the title, and the amount, and we'd like to output this here. But it shouldn't be stored in here, but instead in app.js. There, indeed, in this app component, we could have another constant or variable, expenses, which is an array, so multiple expense items. And let's say every expense here is a simple JavaScript object, which now has a title like car insurance, which also has an amount like the 294.67, and where we have a date like this new date we created here in expense item before. Now again, we don't just have one, but we have, let's say, 3 such expenses here, or maybe 4. Now, to make sure we don't have to type this all by hand, attached you find a simple text file which contains 4 dummy expense items, which you can just grab and copy into your expenses array. These objects also have an extra ID field, which we don't need at the moment though. Nonetheless, now you will have 4 objects inside of this expenses array. And now we want to pass the data of these different objects to these different expense items. That means we want to make these expense items configurable from outside, you could say. The data should not be stored inside of them, but instead received from outside. And that works with this props concept I just mentioned. In app.js, we can simply add attributes to these custom HTML elements, so to these components. I'm using these terms interchangeably here. And for example, we could add a title attribute here to expense item and set this to a value of toilet paper. So we can just type toilet paper here. But now I would in the end again be hard coding some data in this JSX code. Since we already have this expenses array here, I also can dynamically retrieve the title stored in this first expense item for this first expense item here. And we can do this by again using this single curly brace syntax. We can not just use this between opening and closing tags of elements, we can also use it for assigning values to attributes. And here I can then access expenses, which is this array, there the first item with index 0, and there this first item, like all items, is an object which has a title property, for example. So we can access dot title here. And now this title is being passed to this expense item. Now we can do the same for the amount. We set, let's say, an amount attribute, and these attribute names, by the way, are totally up to you. I'm going with title and amount here, but you could pick different names. And as a value for amount, I again access expenses and the first expense there, and then the amount field. And last but not least, we can add a date attribute and access expenses and there the first expense dot date. You just have to make sure that the part after the dot matches the property names here because we are accessing these objects. Now I'll hit the auto format code to make this easier to read by splitting this across multiple lines. And we can now do the same for the other expense items. So I'll just repeat this, but then access the second expense here and the third expense with index 2 and the fourth expense with index 3. Now if we save that, we see no change though, because we only did the first half of the work we need to do. We added these attributes with any names of our choice here because these are our custom elements. Hence these attribute names are up to us. But inside of that component code, so inside of expense item.js, we also now need to do something with these received attribute values. And that's the half which is missing. Now the question is, how do we get access to the values defined in the place where we use our custom components? And the answer is parameters. I mentioned that in regular JavaScript, we use parameters for passing data into functions, and it's kind of similar for React. However, we're now not getting a title and an amount and a date parameter, as you might think, but instead we get one parameter. React will ensure that we get one parameter in every component which we use as a component, like we're doing it here for expense item. And that one parameter will be an object which holds all the received attributes as properties. Hence the name props for the overall concept. Therefore, we get one parameter, and you can name this parameter whatever you want. It's your function. You could name it data. But typically it's named props to make it clear that this is this object which holds all the values we get for the attributes on our custom element. And to be precise, we get key value pairs in this props object here, which is passed in by React automatically. The keys will be the attribute names defined here, so title, amount, and date in my case, and the values, of course, will be the values set here. So if I now want to output the title received, here in this h2 tag, I can now access props dot title, like this. Getting access to this props parameter, and then there to the title property, which will exist because we set a title attribute. Now, if you chose a different name than title here, like for example, name, if you chose that as a name, for example, then you have to access props.name here. So the key which you access on your props object has to be the name you picked for your attribute. Now here I'll go back to title and therefore adjust it here in both places again, but you have to make sure that this matches. Otherwise it'll not work. Now which names you choose, if that's title or name or text or whatever, that's up to you. It's your component. But of course you typically want to choose prop names and therefore attribute names which are self-explanatory and which makes sense. So since we're passing in the amount here, amount makes sense. Something like some number would be valid, but wouldn't make a lot of sense, I guess. So I'll revert that. Now, therefore, in expense item, we can not just output props title, but also props amount. And here for the date, props.date.toISOstring. And that means we can now get rid of these three constants here, since we now get all the data we need from outside this component. We're not defining it inside of the expense item component, inside of this function, but instead it's in the end defined in app.js and passed into expense item for the different usages of expense item through attributes. And that's how you share data between React components. You can make your components truly reusable and configurable by using this props concept, which is one of the key concepts React has to offer. You'll use props all the time, so keep it in mind. It's super important. Props is a super important concept because it allows you to make your components reusable and it allows you to pass data from another component to this component. And hence, if we now have a look, we see these different expenses are rendered with different titles, different dates, and different amounts.